The lamplight in the Roman cell was low enough to make every movement sound louder. Iron scraped iron when the guard slid the bolt, and a stripe of hallway fire found the rough stones at Paul's feet. The old man raised his head, eyes adjusting, hands folded together to warm the knuckles. Outside, a cart rattled over paving stones wet from a late rain, and somewhere in the corridor, a prisoner coughed until the cough turned hoarse. Luke set another fragment of wax to the wick and glanced at the doorway, the way men do when they have learned to expect visitors and trouble together. It was autumn, or close to it. You could feel damp coming through the wall. Demas stood in the angle of light and shadow, his cloak pulled close. He smelled the sour, wet wool and the faint animal fat of the lamp, and told himself the smell would not cling to him after he left. He had walked the same path from the street through the Praetorian guardhouse enough times to do it without thinking, but tonight he counted steps. He nodded to Luke, to the easy kindness in the physician's face, then rested his hands on the table where parchment lay under a stone. Timothy's name appeared in the first line, written in a hand that had learned to be tight to save space. Luke had been Paul's hands on days when the chain bit and made the script tremble. "Winter is coming," Paul said, the words half observation, half habit. He shifted, and the iron links clicked. "Bring the cloak I left in Troas with Carpus, and the books, and above all the parchments." He looked at the page, as if the things needed could climb out of the ink. Demas listened to the old lists with a polite tilt of his head. He knew these voices. He had stood in colder houses in Philippi and felt warmth move through a room when the brothers sang. He had carried letters to Colossae and watched the church there lean toward him as if the news had its own heat. In one of those old greetings, he had been a name worth writing. "Demas greets you." Simple and plain, like a man on the crew list of a ship you trust to make the crossing. He remembered how it had felt to hear the letter read aloud and know he existed somewhere other than in his own skin. Rome, after the fire, had been a different city. Brick under the soot, scaffolds where marble had cracked, gossip running hotter than the wine. Nero's new buildings rose with brisk speed, and so did fear. Anyone close to the apostles felt the change in the air. Night talk shrank to whispers. Doors opened twice before anyone stepped in. The word Christian tasted like risk when said near a market or a bathhouse. Paul had been seized again, not into a comfortable custody, but a hole that smelled like water and rust. The first hearing had not gone well. Luke said it in the careful way doctors say bad news. He defended as he could. No friends stood beside him. Demas was young enough to still think in futures. He had carried money from assemblies that barely lined their own tables and watched Paul give it away with a nod, trusting that the next day would provide. He had watched travel plans collapse under sudden threats and then reset as if nothing had gone wrong. He had believed it when Paul said chains were just another kind of platform. But the city did not look at men like Paul that way anymore. Rome had learned to smile while it sharpened its knives. Work crews summoned men by the day and judged them by the strength of their backs. Thessalonica, they said in the lodging houses, had ships and trade that never stopped. In Thessalonica, you could carry a bale in the morning and a ledger in the evening and go home with coins. No one checked your sleeve for hidden writing. This was what ran through Demas's head when Luke bent over the parchment and Paul dictated names as if laying stones. Crescens to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia, Tychicus to Ephesus. Get Mark and bring him. Alexander the coppersmith did us much harm. The Lord will repay him. Do your best to come before winter. They were not the words of a man about to be released. They were the words of one setting his affairs in a room where the floor stayed damp in every season. When Paul slept, Demas walked to the mouth of the corridor and looked down it to where the guard played at dice with a colleague. He thought of a shopkeeper off the Forum who sold dyed cloth and needed a reliable hand. He thought of a cousin in Thessalonica who wrote once a year and said there was room near the harbor for anyone who could tally and carry. He thought about bread prices, and about Luke's kind eyes, and about the way Paul's breath rattled when the chill settled deep. He thought, lastly, about the phrase that had once lifted him, fellow worker. It sat beside his name in an earlier letter, shoulder to shoulder with Luke's and Mark's, as if they all pulled the same rope. The rope had felt real then. Now it felt like a story that other men told. The morning he left, the city broke clear after fog, and the sun struck brass on a passing standard so bright it made him squint. He did not go first to the cell. He told himself he would return in the afternoon and that there would be a better time then. At the merchant's stall he touched cloth dyed deep purple and thought of Lydia in Philippi. He counted coins with the quick care of a man trying not to feel watched. Rome had a way of making a man hurry even when his feet moved slow. Luke found him near the well where water carriers filled skins. "He asked for you," Luke said, no judgment in it. "He is weaker today." Demas nodded and said he would come after he settled a matter. It was not untrue. A matter was exactly what he was settling, only not one he could speak aloud without hearing his own voice break. He went to the river road instead. A man ferried him to the barge that took grain upstream, and from there he bargained passage on a coastal ship east. He did not tell anyone where he was bound until he had the deck under his feet and the city behind him. He slept on coiled rope and woke to gulls and the taste of salt. Thessalonica waited with a harbor that was always busy, a market that shouted its hours, and inns where the price was written on a board so you could decide without shame. He walked among men who judged him by the weight he could carry and the neatness of his figures. It felt good at first, like climbing out of cold water. Back in Rome, Luke wrote what he could and kept the lamp lit as if light itself could argue with time. Paul dictated his last charges to Timothy and did not soften his language for the young man's sake. Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. The words were not shouted. They were set down the way Luke set stitches, straight, necessary, meant to hold even when the surface was raw. No one added a motive beyond what the line allowed. No one invented a fight or a confession. The statement stood like a stone in a path. You stepped over it and remembered where it was. Thessalonica gave Demas work and a place to keep a lamp. The sea brought cargoes and gossip in equal measure. Traders talked about Dalmatia and Galatia and Rome as if the world were a series of markets on a schedule. Sometimes, on the way back from the pier, Demas took the long street past the synagogue, where the voices of a few believers wove together like threads pulled tight on a loom. He did not go in. If they noticed him in the doorway and nodded, he nodded back. To be asked how Paul fared would require an answer he did not want to shape. When the letters from the East came, copies that traveled like travelers do, by luck and favor, men read them in low rooms with smoke-stained rafters. Demas heard Paul's name spoken with the weight of absence. He learned, as others did, that the old man fought to the end and kept the faith he had set like an anchor in every harbor he visited. Someone asked Demas once if he had known the apostle personally. He said yes, and found that the word emptied him. Later, alone, he repeated it. Yes, yes, as if it might turn into something else if said enough times. History did what it often does when a man steps off the page. It stopped writing him. No second letter added a footnote. No church sent a record of return or repentance or continued absence. Demas kept breathing air. Other men breathed, and bought bread. Other men baked, and grew older in a city that did not care who a man had followed when he was young. If he avoided certain corners where gossip about arrests ran like water, that was his own choice. If he gave alms at a doorway when a beggar's hand shook the way Paul's had with cold, no scribe noted it. Luke never said what he felt when he wrote the line about Demas. He stayed with Paul to the end and took the hard errands no one else could take. When he thought of Demas, he might have remembered a younger face in brighter rooms, a voice raised in prayer before the city turned. Memory works that way. It keeps the early scenes even when the last one is the only line written down. What remained certain was simple and did not change, no matter how often the letters were copied. A man once counted as a fellow worker, left an old friend in a cold cell, and sailed east for a city with sure wages. The charge against him was not theft or violence. It was choosing comfort when a friend's road sank into winter. The record names it without ornament and moves on. You can stand where the Via Ostiense meets the river and hear nothing that helps. You can walk Thessalonica's harbor at dusk and hear everything but the truth of a single heart's decision. The story ends the way the text ends, with the name spoken and the reason given in the brief way ancient letters use. There is no later return, no formal apology, no list of deeds to balance the choice. A man loved the world more than the work and walked away. Another man wrote it down. The rest went quiet. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.